this is Professor Cueto, and this is the first in a series of videos in which I will be guiding you through the writing process for academic writing. So the first thing to understand is that writing is in fact a process that involves multiple steps. So I want you to consider, if you were planning a trip to a foreign country that you've never been to before, would you just buy a plane ticket and show up and see what happens? You could do that, but it's unlikely to be the sort of trip that you were sort of daydreaming about in your mind, right? So you'd obviously want to choose a destination first based on your personal interests, and you might want to make a packing list depending on what time of year you're visiting. You are probably going to want to have at least a rough itinerary of what you want to do when, and you're going to need to do some research to come up with that itinerary, because otherwise you might show up places that are closed when you thought they were open. In order to have that successful trip, you want to make sure that you at least do some rudimentary research and planning, and it's the same with a paper. Expert writers have good writing because they know how to engage in that writing process very carefully. So that's what we're going to be discussing throughout all of these videos. And the first step of that writing process is actually choosing your topic and brainstorming on that topic. Now, depending on the course that you're taking, you might be given a specific topic that you're required to write about, or you might be given a range of options or pretty much free rein to decide what you want to write about as long as the professor approves. If you are given an option, often students will kind of gravitate towards what seems like the easiest one to write about. And oftentimes those end up being really difficult for you to write about, because if you don't have any interest in that topic and you only chose it for sort of practical reasons, then it's going to be difficult for you to really engage in the writing process in the way that you need to. So try to choose something that is of actual interest to you and that you would like to learn more about throughout the process. Once you have chosen your topic, you've got to start your brainstorming process. And there are multiple ways to brainstorm, and whatever works best for you just depends on you personally and how your brain thinks, right? So if you don't have the process in mind yet for yourself, then it's something to work on, figure out what works best for you. But I'll provide you a few of the most commonly used brainstorming techniques. Okay, so the first type of brainstorming is what we call free writing, and that's when you just sit in front of a blank computer screen or a paper and pen, if that works better for you, and you sort of just brain dump anything that comes to mind regarding that topic. Make sure that it leaves your brain and is recorded onto screen or paper. And it doesn't matter for this particular activity if you go off on tangents a lot, because the idea is just to unleash all of the thoughts that you could possibly have in the moment on that particular topic. Let's say that I'm writing a paper on the topic of capital punishment. That's the topic I've chosen, and it's an argumentative paper, and I don't agree with capital punishment, so I'm going to be arguing against it. So here's my brain dump on this topic. And again, grammar doesn't matter here. My font doesn't matter. Misspellings, punctuation, anything like that is not something I was worried about while I was typing this out. So there's a lot of fluff here that I'm not really going to include in my paper, and obviously it's written in a very informal way. But now I can look through this and see if I find any bits and pieces that might work really well to expand on in my paper. So I might start to find some subtopics that I could kind of highlight, and maybe I'll develop entire paragraphs out of those subtopics. Let's take a look. As I start reading through my free write, I start to recognize the main ideas that I have on this topic and the primary reasons that I seem to be against capital punishment. Sometimes we don't really even know why we think what we think until we're forced to write it down. So I'm going to go ahead and highlight all of my main reasons. Clearly, I seem to think that capital punishment is an immoral practice overall, and that's a really big thing that I would want to support. So I'm going to highlight that. Another reason is that I feel like the main job of the criminal justice system should be to keep people safe from dangerous people, and I think putting them in jail is enough for keeping the rest of society safe. We don't necessarily have to kill people who have murdered others in order to do that. Another reason is that if we are talking about punishment or justice, well, for some people, life in prison might actually be a worse punishment than capital punishment anyway, so that could be something for me to look into. Then another reason is the fact that some innocent people do get convicted of murder and put on death row. If I can find a lot of evidence for that, I think that will be a really strong point for my paper, so I will highlight that as well. And then the issue of race is also an important one. If race can play a big role in whether or not someone is wrongly convicted, that's definitely something I would want to talk about, probably in a whole paragraph. And then I've got this other point here about cost. That's a totally different type of reason, and it's something I would also want to address. So if it turns out that it actually is more expensive to put somebody on death row than to have them in prison for life, then that's an economic argument to make against capital punishment. And I've also highlighted here that capital punishment is not even practical. So for a number of reasons, it actually doesn't make sense, even disregarding the moral aspects. As I'm saying this, I'm starting to realize that really all of my reasons fall into one of the bigger umbrella categories. It's either a reason that has to do with the morality of capital punishment or a reason that has to do with the practicality of capital punishment. So I'm thinking that for my paper, I'm probably going to end up giving reasons for both. And I'm going to go ahead and write like a little argument sentence right now, just to sort of solidify my main argument in my mind. This will eventually become my thesis statement and will become much more refined. But it helps once you have an idea of like, here's my real argument, to write it down. So let me go ahead and type out: the US should abolish capital punishment for both moral and practical reasons. And you know what? I think I actually want to do practical first, because I feel like maybe putting the moral reasons at the end would pack more of a punch. I don't know. I could change my mind. So at least I have a really simple idea of where my argument is going to go here. And what I'd like to do is actually highlight practical and moral in different colors. So let's make practical blue there. And now for moral, let's choose a different color. Okay, because now I can go back to my free write and start to sort of categorize all of my reasons. So let's go one by one. The main job of the criminal justice system should be to keep people safe from dangerous people. That seems to me to be more of a practical reason, just the function of the criminal justice system. What's to say that death is even a worse punishment than life in prison? That one's a little tricky. I think it would probably belong more in the practical category. What if the person was wrongly convicted and is actually innocent? That's definitely a reason that has to do with ethics. So I'm going to highlight that one for morality. Race can play a big role. Okay, so the racial issue there is also a moral one. And then the cost issue, this is economic, so that's more of a practical one. Okay, so now I can see how this is laying out. I've got 5 different reasons here, 3 practical, 2 moral. It's fine if you don't have the exact number on both sides. I mean, that's just how it turned out. But maybe I don't need 5 subtopics for my paper. Let's say I only need 4 of them. Well, then I'm going to go ahead and just choose whichever I think are the strongest 4 reasons. I might end up just choosing one of these 2, or maybe merging these somehow, and then combining that with the economic for my practical reasons, and then having these 2 moral reasons. So now I've done this free write, and I've thought the free write through, and it really has started to allow my paper to take shape in my mind before I've even started drafting anything at all. So that's the free write. Another way that you could brainstorm is to sort of like bullet point your ideas. This is the one I traditionally use because I think in a very organized way. For my bullet list, I wanted to list as many reasons as I could think of for why I felt that capital punishment should be abolished. Here's what I've got. Sometimes you get wrongful convictions. Even criminals have a right to live. Maybe they've lost their right to their freedom, but I still feel that they have a right to their lives. Life in prison could be sufficient punishment for a lot of these criminals. capital punishment is too expensive, there's discrimination in the legal system, and lethal injection and the electric chair, which are the forms of capital punishment used in the US, are particularly cruel in my view. Okay, so the first thing I want to do once I come up with my full list, and of course it could be a much longer list than this, is I want to look through and see if there's anything that's really not going to cut it in my paper, something that I really won't be able to fully develop. And for me, the third one here, life in prison is sufficient punishment, I can't really imagine too much that I would be able to say about that in a whole paragraph. So I feel like maybe that shouldn't really be one of my subtopics. I'm gonna go ahead and eliminate that one. And now what I want to consider is, if I like all of these, what would be the best order to put them in for my paper? If I wanted a paragraph on each one of these, for example. Well, I'm noticing that the capital punishment is too expensive one kind of stands out because in this list, that's my only practical reason for eliminating it. All of the other reasons are more moral. So maybe I'll start with that one so that my paper will start with a more practical reason, and then the rest of my reasons from then onward will be the moral ones. And then I've got wrongful convictions, even criminals have a right to live, discrimination, and cruelty. Something else I'm noticing as I read those is that I kind of feel like the criminals having a right to live and the cruelty of the capital punishment practice maybe should really be part of the same paragraph, because both of them have to do with my feeling that capital punishment as a practice is kind of inhumane. So I think I might actually just add that as a subtopic. I'm going to say that it's too inhumane, and then put cruelty and criminals have a right to live under that. And so these two could just be kind of supporting points for this bigger subtopic. Of course, I can go back and start adding supporting points to the other ones. Later on, as I continue working on my paper, I may decide to reorder these a little bit. I may decide that too inhumane would go earlier. But I'm pretty sure I'm going to keep the practical one first and then my moral ones. I may just revise the order of my moral ones. So this is always a work in progress. But once again, you could see how your paper starts to take shape a little bit. So that's the bullet list option. And then the probably most visual option is the sort of mapping. For the mapping option, you've got your central circle with the main topic written in it, why capital punishment should be abolished in the US. And then you branch out from that circle with the subtopics that help to support that. So I've got all of my subtopics here: wrongful convictions, it's too inhumane, discrimination in the legal system, and the expense of capital punishment. I haven't decided on the best order yet, but for now, we're just kind of throwing them into our map. And now you can see how it's fairly easy to branch out even further and come up with mini subtopics for your subtopics. So these are kind of the supporting points. And for too inhumane, I already had some ideas in my bullet list. I'm going to add them here: cruelty of lethal injection or the electric chair, and the right to life, even for criminals. And for wrongful convictions, I went ahead and added one. DNA evidence has shown that people have been convicted who were innocent. For discrimination in the legal system, I thought of a couple that I could add. I could talk a little bit about ways that people are discriminated against in the legal system for their race, their ethnicity, their gender, etc. Could do some research on that. And I also remembered the Central Park 5 case, which was a particular case where discrimination came into play. And then for expensive capital punishment, I couldn't really think of anything right now, but that's okay. I'm pretty sure with research, I could come up with some supporting points for that. You might notice that some of the supporting points that I added in here came up in my free write. They weren't the best options for main subtopics, but some of them worked out as supporting points. So use whatever variety you need to come up with as many ideas as you can and organize them in a way that's going to work well in your paper. Now that you've brainstormed, you have some real ideas to work from, and so you're ready to actually start developing your thesis statement, which is the main point of your entire paper. That's going to be our next lesson. So see you there.